Right now, language feels so completely natural, so effortlessly built into ordinary human existence, that it's truly difficult to imagine a version of humanity that couldn't actually talk. But there was, at some point in our evolutionary history, a very real transition, a period when our ancestors communicated using only gestures, calls, and expressions without anything resembling the complex, structured spoken language that defines virtually every human interaction today. So when did humans actually start talking? And how do researchers even begin to investigate a question this fundamentally difficult to directly, physically observe? Let's dig into this properly, because the honest answer involves piecing together clues from multiple, completely different scientific fields, and it reveals a seriously fascinating, still actively debated area of ongoing research. Let's start with the most important methodological challenge worth understanding first, because it explains why this particular question remains so persistently difficult to answer with complete confidence. Unlike stone tools, bone fragments, or even ancient artwork, spoken language itself leaves absolutely no direct physical trace whatsoever. There's no fossilized sentence, no preserved ancient conversation, nothing physically tangible that researchers can directly examine and confidently date the way they can with countless other aspects of early human life and technology already explored throughout other topics. This means researchers studying the origins of human language have to rely entirely on indirect evidence, examining fossilized anatomy relevant to speech production, genetic evidence, and various forms of indirect behavioral and archaeological inference, rather than any kind of direct physical evidence of language itself. Let's talk about the specific anatomical evidence researchers examine, because this represents one of the most important, extensively studied lines of evidence relevant to this whole topic. Producing the wide range of distinct sounds involved in human speech requires a very specific vocal tract anatomy, including a notably lowered larynx position compared to most other primates, which creates the additional vocal tract space needed to produce the particular range of vowel sounds essential to human speech. Researchers examining the skull and neck anatomy of various fossilized human ancestors have looked specifically for physical indicators suggesting this particular kind of lowered larynx position, though this specific anatomical feature is notoriously difficult to confirm with complete confidence from skeletal remains alone, since the larynx itself is composed of soft tissue that doesn't actually fossilize or otherwise survive in the physical archaeological record. This detail helps explain why anatomical evidence alone can't provide a completely definitive answer regarding exactly when humans developed the capacity for complex speech. Researchers can identify skeletal features broadly consistent with a vocal tract anatomy capable of supporting complex speech, but confirming with absolute certainty exactly when a specific fossilized ancestor actually possessed this capability based on indirect skeletal evidence alone remains considerably more difficult and uncertain than researchers might ideally prefer. Let's talk about the hyoid bone specifically, because this represents a particularly interesting, frequently discussed piece of anatomical evidence worth exploring in more detail. The hyoid bone, a small, U-shaped bone located in the neck that plays an important supportive role in speech production and swallowing, does occasionally survive in the fossil record, unlike the larynx itself. Discoveries of hyoid bones from certain early human ancestors, including some Neanderthal remains showing a shape and structure quite similar to the modern human hyoid bone, have led some researchers to propose that these particular ancestors may have possessed at least some meaningful capacity for speech production. Though this specific interpretation remains actively debated among researchers, since hyoid bone shape alone doesn't necessarily provide completely conclusive proof regarding the full range of complex speech capability more broadly. Let's talk about genetic evidence too, because this represents another significant, increasingly important line of evidence worth exploring specifically. Researchers have identified specific genes, including one particularly well-studied gene often referred to by its scientific abbreviation, closely linked to language and speech capability in modern humans, with certain mutations in this specific gene known to cause significant speech and language difficulties in affected individuals today. By comparing versions of this specific gene across modern humans, Neanderthals, and other early human relatives using ancient DNA extraction techniques already discussed at length in other explorations of ancient genetic research more broadly, researchers have found that Neanderthals possessed a version of this particular gene quite similar to the modern human version, suggesting Neanderthals may have possessed at least some meaningful genetic foundation supporting complex language capability. Though again, genetic similarity alone doesn't necessarily provide completely definitive proof of full, actual language use in practice. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it illustrates a recurring pattern throughout this entire topic. Individual pieces of evidence, anatomical, genetic, or archaeological, each provide meaningful, suggestive clues, but none of them alone provides completely conclusive, universally agreed upon proof regarding exactly when complex human language actually first emerged. Researchers generally have to weigh and combine multiple different, independent lines of evidence together, building an overall probabilistic picture rather than pointing to any single, definitively conclusive piece of evidence that settles this specific question beyond any reasonable doubt or ongoing scientific debate. Let's talk about archaeological and behavioral evidence too, because this represents another important, complementary category of evidence worth exploring specifically. Researchers look at evidence of complex, coordinated behavior, sophisticated tool-making traditions, evidence of complex social organization and cooperation, and symbolic or artistic expression already explored extensively in other discussions regarding ancient cave art and symbolic behavior more generally, reasoning that this kind of behavioral complexity likely required, or at minimum strongly benefited from, some meaningful capacity for complex communication and language to actually coordinate and transmit effectively across a group and across successive generations. The emergence of increasingly sophisticated tool traditions, requiring detailed, multi-step technical instruction to successfully teach and pass down accurately, is sometimes cited as indirect behavioral evidence, suggesting increasingly sophisticated language capability likely developed alongside, or at least closely connected to, these observable increases in technological and cultural complexity more broadly. Let's talk about that specific language-related gene in more precise detail, because it deserves a more thorough explanation given how frequently it comes up in discussions of this broader topic. The gene in question, known scientifically as FOXP2, was first identified through studies of a specific family experiencing severe inherited speech and language difficulties, allowing researchers to pinpoint a specific genetic mutation directly linked to significant problems with the fine motor control needed for clear speech production, along with broader language processing difficulties more generally. This discovery provided researchers with a specific, concrete genetic marker they could then trace across different species and different ancient human populations, comparing the specific version of this gene present in modern humans against the versions found in chimpanzees, Neanderthals, and other early human relatives. While FOXP2 alone certainly doesn't account for the entire complex genetic and neurological foundation underlying full human language capability, which almost certainly involves numerous different genes and neurological systems working together in complex, interconnected ways. It represents one of the clearest, most specific genetic threads researchers have been able to directly trace and meaningfully compare across different species and ancient populations. Let's talk about earbone anatomy too, because this represents another, somewhat less commonly discussed, but remarkably interesting piece of anatomical evidence worth exploring specifically. Researchers studying certain fossilized early human ancestors have examined the specific structure of tiny bones within the ear, finding that certain early hominin species show ear anatomy seemingly well-suited to detecting the specific frequency range most relevant to human speech sounds specifically, rather than the somewhat different frequency range most relevant to typical primate vocal communication more broadly. This detail is worth including because it adds an interesting additional angle to the broader anatomical evidence already discussed, suggesting that the capacity to effectively hear and distinguish speech-relevant sounds may have evolved alongside, or even somewhat ahead of, the capacity to actually physically produce those same specific sounds, which makes a certain amount of evolutionary sense given that effectively receiving and interpreting communication would presumably need to develop in reasonably close coordination with the capacity to actually produce that same communication in the first place. Let's talk about vocal learning in other species too, because this represents a truly fascinating comparative angle worth exploring in more depth, offering useful insight into the broader evolutionary puzzle of how complex vocal communication systems develop in the first place. Very few animal species besides humans demonstrate genuine vocal learning, the capacity to learn and modify vocal sounds based on exposure to and imitation of other individuals, rather than simply producing a fixed, largely instinctive set of vocal calls determined almost entirely by genetics alone. Certain bird species, including parrots and songbirds, along with a small number of other mammal species, including certain whales and dolphins, hominins, represent some of the only other animals demonstrating this specific vocal learning capability. Studying exactly how and why vocal learning evolved independently in these completely unrelated species offers researchers valuable comparative insight into the broader evolutionary pressures and neurological requirements that generally tend to favor the development of this kind of flexible, learned vocal communication capability, insight that can then be cautiously, appropriately applied to help inform theories regarding how and why this same basic capability likely evolved within the human evolutionary lineage specifically. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about the specific challenge of studying brain tissue and neural structures relevant to language too, because this represents another significant, ongoing methodological challenge worth addressing directly. Unlike bones, which can survive and fossilize for enormous stretches of time, brain tissue itself doesn't preserve in the fossil record at all, meaning researchers can't directly examine the actual neural structures of ancient human ancestors' brains. Instead, researchers rely on studying the internal shape and volume of fossilized skulls, which can provide some indirect insight into overall brain size and, in some cases, the general shape and proportions of different brain regions, including regions known to play an important role in language processing in modern humans. This indirect method, sometimes called paleoneurology, has provided valuable, if inherently limited, insight into how brain regions relevant to language may have evolved and changed over time, even though it obviously can't provide anywhere near the same level of detailed insight that direct examination of actual neural tissue and connectivity would ideally provide if such direct examination were actually possible using currently available scientific methods and techniques. Let's talk about gesture and its possible role as a precursor to spoken language too, because this represents an interesting, actively researched theoretical framework worth exploring specifically. Some researchers propose that complex gestural communication may have developed before or alongside complex vocal language, potentially serving as an important evolutionary stepping stone or parallel communication system that helped establish the underlying cognitive and social foundations that spoken language eventually built directly upon. This theory draws some support from observations of gestural communication in modern great apes, which demonstrate considerably more flexible, apparently intentional, gestural communication compared to their comparatively more limited, largely fixed vocal communication repertoire, suggesting that flexible, intentional communication more broadly may have initially developed through gesture, before eventually extending into, or being supplemented by, increasingly sophisticated vocal communication as well. Let's talk about the specific social and evolutionary pressures that likely favored the development of complex language in the first place too, because understanding the underlying evolutionary logic helps make sense of why this specific capability likely developed within the human evolutionary lineage specifically. Researchers generally propose that increasingly complex human social structures, involving large cooperative social groups requiring coordination around shared tasks like hunting, resource sharing, and childcare already discussed extensively in other explorations of early human social organization, would have created strong, ongoing evolutionary pressure favoring increasingly sophisticated communication capability. The ability to communicate detailed, specific information, plan coordinated group activities, share accumulated practical knowledge across generations, and maintain complex social relationships and alliances within an increasingly large social group would have provided substantial, measurable survival and reproductive advantages, creating sustained evolutionary pressure favoring individuals and populations with increasingly sophisticated communication capability over successive generations. Let's talk about how this whole topic connects to the broader emergence of behaviorally modern human culture too, because this represents an important, frequently discussed connection worth exploring directly. Many researchers specifically connect the emergence of fully complex, modern human language capability to the broader archaeological pattern often referred to as the emergence of behavioral modernity, a period marked by a notable increase in symbolic art, sophisticated tool traditions, complex burial practices, and other clear indicators of sophisticated abstract thought and cultural complexity already explored extensively throughout other discussions of ancient human cave art and symbolic behavior specifically. The reasoning behind this connection makes intuitive sense. fully developing and effectively transmitting this kind of increasingly sophisticated cultural knowledge and symbolic meaning across a community and across successive generations would have been considerably more difficult, if not practically impossible, without a correspondingly sophisticated capacity for complex, abstract language capable of communicating ideas well beyond immediate, concrete physical objects and observable events. Let's talk about the different competing theories regarding the actual timeline for language emergence too, because researchers don't currently share a single, universally agreed upon answer regarding exactly when complex human language first developed, and it's worth presenting this ongoing scientific debate honestly rather than presenting one single theory as though it were definitively, universally settled and accepted. Some researchers propose language capability developed gradually, over an extended period potentially spanning hundreds of thousands of years, with increasingly sophisticated forms of vocal communication slowly developing alongside other aspects of increasing cognitive and social complexity throughout human evolutionary history. Other researchers propose a somewhat more rapid, relatively recent emergence of fully modern, complex language capability, potentially connected to specific genetic changes or cognitive developments occurring within a considerably narrower evolutionary timeframe, possibly connected to the broader emergence of behaviorally modern humans and the associated explosion of symbolic art, sophisticated tool traditions, and other complex cultural behaviors already discussed extensively in other explorations of this general period of human history. This disagreement among researchers is worth acknowledging honestly, because it reflects genuine, ongoing scientific uncertainty rather than any kind of simple, fully settled consensus. Different researchers examining different specific pieces of anatomical, genetic, and archaeological evidence, and applying different theoretical frameworks regarding exactly how language capability likely relates to other observable aspects of cognitive and cultural development, have arrived at meaningfully different conclusions regarding the specific timeline involved. And this disagreement remains an active, ongoing area of scientific research and debate rather than a fully settled question with one single, universally agreed upon answer. Let's talk about the distinction between basic vocal communication and fully complex, grammatically structured language too, because this represents an important conceptual distinction worth drawing out explicitly. Many animal species, discussed at greater length in other explorations of animal cognition and communication more broadly, possess meaningful vocal communication systems, capable of conveying specific information regarding danger, food sources, or social status. But full human language, involving complex grammar, abstract concepts, and the capacity to communicate about things not immediately present or directly observable, represents something considerably more sophisticated and complex compared to these more basic animal vocal communication systems. Understanding when humans developed this full range of complex grammatical and abstract linguistic capability, as opposed to simpler, more limited forms of vocal communication that may have developed considerably earlier in our evolutionary history, represents a particularly important, specific distinction worth keeping firmly in mind throughout this entire broader discussion. Let's talk about how researchers study modern language acquisition in children as a potential source of relevant, indirect insight too, because this represents an interesting, complementary research approach worth mentioning specifically. Some researchers studying language evolution look to how modern human children naturally acquire language, seemingly through an innate, biologically supported developmental process, as potential indirect insight into how language capability may have originally evolved and developed within the human species more broadly. This comparative approach, while certainly not providing direct conclusive evidence regarding the specific ancient evolutionary timeline already discussed, offers researchers additional theoretical insight into the underlying cognitive architecture and developmental processes that likely needed to evolve within the human brain and body to make complex language possible in the first place. Let's talk briefly about click languages too, because they offer an interesting, somewhat unexpected piece of linguistic evidence worth mentioning, specifically before wrapping up this discussion. Certain modern human languages, particularly several found among specific populations in southern Africa, incorporate distinctive click consonants as a fundamental part of their sound system. Sounds that some linguists have proposed might represent a particularly ancient linguistic feature, given that genetic evidence suggests these specific populations diverged early from the broader human family tree. While this specific theory remains actively debated and far from definitively confirmed, since click sounds could equally have developed independently at a later point rather than necessarily representing some kind of preserved ancient linguistic feature, the broader question of how linguistic diversity itself relates to deep human population. History represents another truly interesting, actively researched thread connecting modern linguistics directly back to the same deep evolutionary questions already explored throughout the rest of this topic. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, honest answer to when humans started talking turns out to remain a remarkably open, actively debated scientific question, rather than a fully settled matter with one single, universally agreed upon answer. Researchers rely on a careful combination of anatomical evidence, including the notoriously difficult to confirm larynx position and the more directly observable hyoid bone structure, genetic evidence regarding specific genes closely linked to language capability, and archaeological evidence regarding increasingly sophisticated tool-making, social organization, and symbolic behavior to construct an overall, probabilistic picture regarding when and how complex human language likely developed. Different researchers weighing this same combination of evidence somewhat differently have proposed meaningfully different specific timelines, ranging from a considerably more gradual development spanning hundreds of thousands of years to a comparatively more rapid, relatively recent emergence connected to the broader flourishing of behaviorally modern human culture and symbolic expression. So the next time you have an ordinary, effortless conversation without giving it a second thought, it's worth appreciating that you're using a capability whose actual evolutionary origin remains, even today, a actually open, actively researched scientific question. One that researchers continue investigating using an impressively creative, interdisciplinary combination of anatomical, genetic, and archaeological evidence, each contributing a partial, incomplete piece toward an overall picture that still isn't, and may never be, completely, definitively resolved with absolute scientific certainty. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as fundamental and universally human as spoken language still leaves researchers working with this much genuine scientific uncertainty regarding exactly when and how it first emerged, despite drawing on multiple entirely different scientific fields and methods of investigation, what does that suggest about how many other seemingly basic, obviously settled questions about our own deep evolutionary and cultural history might actually remain considerably more really uncertain and actively contested than casual popular discussion of these topics typically tends to suggest or acknowledge?